today, I have two very special guests that are going to be willing to share their journey of their child, Josh, who battled addiction. And they're just going to share kind of what they learned through it as parents. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lamar and Cindy Slay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being my guest and being willing to share. I've said this before, it's even for me, sometimes I talk about my panic and my anxiety very intellectually. But if you're the one going through that, it doesn't feel intellectual. It feels very visceral. It feels very much in the gut. And so I want you to know, even though I talk about it intellectually, and even though I know they will share a lot of intellect about how they process this journey, at the moment when they were going through it, it's very visceral. It's very real. So thank you for being here and being willing to share. So Lamar, I'll just let you maybe share, how it all started.
Well, our middle child, Josh, was a very, very competitive athlete all through high school. He played everything, did everything well. Coaches often laughed and said he was the coach on the field. But he was small. He wasn't big enough to play college sports. So when he finished high school, he really lost anything that he was passionate about in his life. We noticed it at the end of his junior year. There was some alcohol involved. But as he went off to college, he really didn't have anything that he was really passionate about. And so he found his way into marijuana, and then different drugs, and it just kind of went downhill from there. It kind of came to a head after his freshman year in college when he was getting ready to go back. I had suspicion that he was having some drugs and alcohol, and so I wanted him to take a drug test before he went back to school. We had some rules in our family. One of them was we set a standard for our kids in college, and we only paid for certain grades. And if a kid didn't make that grade in that age, then he had to pay for those 3 hours the next semester. And then if he got the grades up, we'd reimburse him. So I said, before we're going to pay anything for you to go back to school, I want you to take a drug test, and he wouldn't do it. So he went back to school without any financial aid from us. And that's where we really began to see that he had the drug and alcohol problem.
Wow. So how old was he at that time?
He was going into his sophomore year in college.
In college. What do you think I always feel like drugs and alcohol, or even addiction, it's driven by an emotion. It's driven by either fear, anxiety, depression. What do you feel like was driving his need to, what I would say, self-medicate?
Well, his athletics and his accomplishments had been where his self-esteem came from. And then all of a sudden that was gone. And so Josh was always the life of the party. He was who you wanted to be there. He would, we had many trips to the principal's office with Josh in high school, and usually it was because of his mouth. He would say something, and then the next thing, the three of us would be in the principal's office. And to be honest with you, he was really funny. I mean, the problem is the teachers would always laugh with whatever he said, and then they would send him to the principal's office. And I asked him one time, I said, Josh, do you know sometimes when you think of something funny to say, you know you're going to get in trouble, and you just decide it's worth it? He goes, oh, yeah, Dad, all the time. So he was wasn't really the class clown because he did well in school, but he was the center of the party all the time. Well, when athletics were stripped away from him, there went a lot of his self-image. And so he was just trying to find something where he'd be accepted and be part of the game.
And I think he always had a little bit of impulse control issues. His very first trip to the principal's office was in 3-year-old preschool. So it started very young. And they called me into the office and asked if I minded them moving Josh from morning to afternoon preschool, that they had too many troublemakers in the morning preschool. And I looked at him with tears in my eyes because it was my first trip to the principal's office with one of my kids, and I didn't think it would happen quite that early. And I said, well, why are you moving my child instead of one of the other childs? And then I thought a minute, no, never mind, I know. Chief troublemaker is my son. He was full of life, but he was very, very mischievous. He drove our car at age 4. He got in the car, and our driveway had a slope on it, and he had seen us put it in gear enough. He put it in neutral, and it just slid on down the driveway. Thankfully, nobody was coming, and it had a curb that it stopped. And we were standing in the front yard. We were not letting him roam around. We were right there, and all of a sudden, he's in the car driving the car.
He was always on the edge.
Always on the edge.
When he would go into a basketball game, in the first couple of minutes, he would get 2 fouls. And then he wouldn't get any more. He had to know what the referees were going to call. So he'd find those boundaries, and he would do that. And he was incredibly sharp. We had au pairs that lived with us, and we came home one day, and the au pair was outside, and he was on the inside. And he had gotten her mad at him and gone out the back door and run around the house and gone in the front door and locked the door and then went and locked the back door. And she was sitting on the steps. So we had a new au pair. Yeah, it was 4 or 5.
Yeah.
We had a new au pair, and I told her, I said, you're going to have to get your bluff in on this kid or he'll make your life miserable. And early on, I came home, and he's sitting on the front porch, soaking wet. And I said, what happened to you? And he said, I'm mad at
Anna.
Yeah, Anna. And I said, what did she do? Said she sprayed me with a hose. So he'd gone out the back door to come around. She'd gone out the front door and got the hose and was waiting on him when he came around. And then they were best friends. After that, they were best friends. So he always had to know where the boundaries were. And he would expose a weak teacher. If a teacher was inconsistent with discipline, he would expose her right off the bat. So you had to have your act together to be a parent, to be a teacher, to be whatever with Josh. That's just the way he was wired.
That's so interesting. So looking back through high school, and so many young people do put their whole energy into a sport, or I have a friend who, one of the students put their soul into being the band director, and they do get to that senior year, and their whole identity now is kind of crumbling. Is there anything looking back, what advice would you give to a parent on, how can they navigate that? Is there anything you would do different? I don't know, maybe you wouldn't. Is there anything you would do different to, now that you know his temperament and how that affected him at the end of 12 years?
You know, Josh was in church. He heard a lot of teaching on self-image. There were a lot of things that were done right. Obviously, there were mistakes made. But as I look back on it, I don't know of any one thing that I would say, no, we should have done this, we should have done that. I think one of the things parents have to learn is kids have their own free will. They're made that way by God. And sometimes they have to make those bad decisions in order to learn how to make good decisions.
And we really struggled with letting him go off to college because we knew that there's so much more freedom, and we were scared to death what he would do. But we also felt like that he needed to sink or swim on his own away, because we kept a pretty tight rein on him. He was grounded his entire senior year. Now, that's a pretty tough, he and some friends had gotten involved in alcohol, and so we didn't totally eliminate his social life, but the party was at our house so that we could watch it. He was somewhat grounded, not completely grounded, but his senior year, for us to try to keep him in check.
Yeah, he lettered in being grounded.
He did.
And one of the things that we would let him do is he couldn't go anywhere, but he could invite his friends to our house. And he thought that was great until he realized we had developed relationships with all his friends. And his friends wanted to come to our house. And that's how we got to know, we learned who his friends were. But it wasn't just that he was grounded. We were trying to teach him how to be a godly guy. And so sometimes parents, it was hard on us because that meant a lot of times we had to stay home. We couldn't leave, but it was worth it.
I do remember when he was little, he was very strong-willed, and we believed in spanking. We didn't spank a lot, but we did. Well, but with Josh, all he would do is look at you and say, that didn't hurt. So what you want to do is spank him harder to make it hurt, so he gets to the point. And it got to the point we said, okay, number one, we're not going to hurt our child. Okay, we're not going to do that. And number two, it's not working. Okay, so you have to find their currency. What is the most important thing to them that you can take away? He loved timeout. He didn't have any trouble with timeout. He liked being alone. He didn't have any trouble with that. So we're going, okay, what can we do? Well, the only thing that would really get his attention is if he had to miss a sports practice. I don't think we ever made him miss a game, but he had to stay home from practice. And now, you got to remember, he's in first and second grade. He's little, but he loved sports. And literally, the end of the world if you take a sports practice away from him, the end of the world. And so I hated doing that because I felt like if you're a team, you need to be there and all of that, but it was the only thing that got his attention. And we were more interested in his character and him learning self-control and him learning that rules in our household are going to be enforced than missing a first grade soccer practice. And so that's what we did. But he was always just wired differently, and he was very hard to discipline in that way.
I like what you said, though. There's a big principle that you said is that you're parenting to teach him for later in life.
Yes.
You are, the role of a parent is developing the future person.
Yeah,
right?
it's to teach them to leave.
That's it.
I mean, you're preparing them to get rid of them.
Yes. And that they can live a successful life when they're gone.
Independent.
So it's, and
Yes.
the consequences, I tell my parents, my clients many times, you need to remember the consequences of their actions before the age of 18 is much less than after the age of 18.
Yeah.
So you do have to let them fail and not overprotect. We live in a culture right now, and we kind of call them, there's helicopter parents, there's want to protect everything, and there's lawnmower parents. I just learned some of this terminology that they want to mow down all their problems so that they have a smooth path. Well, you know what? Life is not smooth.
It is not.
So if you don't allow them to experience some of the pain of their choices, they won't understand and connect the dots of, I chose this behavior, even though I'm having problems with my impulse control, I chose it. And I think in that moment, you can empathize with kids. I am so sorry that you chose that. I don't think it's ever healthy to say, I told you so.
Yeah.
It's because your goal as a parent is to always build the relationship, keep the connection between the parent and the child. Because there again, as you said, you had the kids come to your house. What that also does, you build relationship with those other friends. And now when Josh may be tempted to pull himself into either a drug or alcohol situation, those friends care for you, and therefore they care for Josh, and they're going to hopefully pull him in the right direction. So a friend is going to always pull them in the right direction. It's very important. Parents, it's very important that you do interact and get to know your children's friends, because they will either pull them up or they will pull them down. It's just like for adults. We have to make the choice, right? Who we hang with. They're either going to pull us up in life or they're going to pull us down. And it's so important that we teach that to our children.
And life's not fair. It's not. And we even when something at school happened that wasn't fair, we had to really talk about it and evaluate, is this a situation where we need to step in, or is this a situation where we need to let our son learn that life is not fair, and to realize that there may have been some things that he set himself up for this. And so, and we had both situations. There were times where we would step in, but we made sure that we were very careful when we did that, because they needed to know that life isn't fair.
Yeah, I think part of a parent's responsibility is to protect your kids.
Yes.
Sometimes you protect them from an injustice, but other times you protect them by letting them suffer the consequences of their actions. That's protecting them as well.
That's exactly right. That's what boundaries are, right? Is
Yes.
we're teaching them boundaries, right? There are rules in life, right?
Yeah.
Now they just break little rules, what they see as little rules in school, but you get out and you drink and then drive, there's bigger rules.
There's
now you've got
bigger
a
rules.
felony.
Yeah.
So what we're teaching them in the home is very valuable for the adult that they're going to be.
And Josh always had his big hairy toe on the boundary line, always. That's where he lived, and sometimes you get in trouble that way.
So I think something that was important for us is we made the rules that we had in our house very clear from early on.
Yes.
And one of those rules was you cannot do drugs and alcohols in our home. You can't live here if you do that. If you can do that, you've got more money than we do, and you can go find your own place to live. So consequently, as Josh was not invited back to college after his sophomore year, he came home. It began a process of 5 or 6 times where we asked him to leave, and we basically kicked him out of the house because he would come home, he would have a good period, and then he would get high, he would get drunk, and we said, Josh, you can't live here if you do that. So 5 or 6 times we saw him on the street living because he had broken the rules. And the last couple of times, we didn't even have to tell him to leave. He came home, he did good for a while, then he would get drunk or he would get on drugs, and he packed up and left the next morning on his own.
And I think, I don't know what the current thinking on all of this is, but I do think there's alcohol and drug abuse, and there's alcohol and drug addiction. And Josh's friends will even tell you from the very first time he had a beer, he couldn't stop with one. I really think he was truly addicted. I think there was a lot of the times he went to, was it 6 or 7 drug rehabs? I think he really wanted to kick it, but it had a really big hold on him. It wasn't just abuse, it was addiction in his life. And it's gripping. It's gripping. And if you ask him one time, I said, Josh, what are your triggers to drink or do drugs? He goes, air, just breathing. And I think he's been sober 13 years now. And I think he still puts himself in a position of being accountable to other people. He has an accountability group that he is very, very strong, that they speak into each other's lives quite a bit, and I think that's probably one of the biggest keys to keeping him sober.
Yeah. Josh, we had some rules with him when he got into drugs and alcohols. One is we let him keep his phone, but we controlled through AT&T who he could call and who could call him. And our commitment to him was anytime he wanted to get help, he could call home, and I would go pick him up wherever he was, but he would go straight to rehab. So all those 5 or 6 times he would call, he'd be at the bottom. I would drive to pick him up. Cindy would be on the phone finding a rehab place that would take our insurance, that would take him. I would pick him up. He would beg me to let him come home just one night. And I said, no, Josh, that's not the rules. And I would take him to rehab.
That was hard because you wanted him to come home. You wanted him to think, my love is enough. You know, if we love and encourage him, and it's not with true addiction. It's not it has nothing to do with you or how much you loved him, or even the boundaries that sometimes you set earlier on. Sometimes it does, but we had had pretty strong boundaries. And I think one thing that when we were going through all of this, particularly for moms, there's a lot of guilt and shame on the parents that are not necessarily valid guilt and shame. And sometimes it was embarrassing enough that I just wanted to hide, and I realized, I can't do that. I can't, but I felt like I was being dishonest with people because I didn't tell them what was going on in my life. And then as it progressed on and I got a little bit better handle on that, then I would tell everybody about it. I was going, I don't think I have to do that either. Do you know what I mean? It's not a matter of how many you tell or what you tell. It's a matter of being at peace that you've done everything that you should do to help your child, because there's so much guilt and shame. And it's not. It's for the large degree, it's a matter of the choices they have made. Right.
What do you think, Cindy, brings on the guilt? What was the guilt and shamed it?
Well, I think for me, Josh is the child that was most like me. And sometimes they say that's the hardest one to parent. And so he was always the hardest one for me. And he knew exactly what to do to get my goat. And I think he enjoyed making me lose my cool, and he loved that. And I don't know if he thought he won. I don't know, but that they just pick at you. It's much, much harder to do for Lamar, for him to lose his cool. But so there was this tension between he and I, and I always felt like that not that I didn't do enough for him. I did a lot for the kids. It wasn't that. It was that I didn't relate and connect to him in the same way that I wanted to, because there was always this tension. And I remember the first or second rehab he was in, we had a family time together, and those were always so emotional. Oh, my goodness. I think towards the end of number 6 or 7, you're going, I don't think I could do this again, is bring out all of that. But we were sharing things with one another in the presence of a counselor. And I told him, I said, Josh, I just want to apologize to you if I was not the mom that you needed. There was never any doubt how much I loved you and was there for you. But if I wasn't the mom you needed, because our 3 kids were so different, and I just didn't feel like I just didn't find that niche like I did with the girls. I said, I really want to apologize with you. And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, Mom, this is not your fault. This is the choice of my action. This is the consequences of my actions. And that really, I don't think he'll ever know how much that helped me.
Right.
But it was huge that even in his very first rehab, he knew that this was a decision he made.
Not about someone else's behavior.
Yeah. He didn't really ever blame. And one of the times the counselor.
Yeah, we were
story.
at one of the family weekends and his 4th or 5th rehab. And I'd been asked this question before by counselors. They said, what did you do with Josh? How did you treat Josh? How did you parent him? And I could never figure out what they were talking about. And finally, this counselor, a non-Christian counselor, asked me, said, how did you treat Josh? And I said, what do you mean? She says, well, no matter what we do, we can't get Josh to blame you all as parents. And I said, well, the only thing I can tell you is that whatever consequences we set up with Josh, we did everything within our ability to follow through. If we said, if you do this, this is going to happen, we did it. And one of those things was, you can't live in our house if you're doing alcohol and drugs. And this lady looked at me and she said, that's it. I said, well, what are you talking about? She said, Josh knows you proved to him that he can trust you to do what you say you're going to do. So he knows when you tell him you love him, he can trust you that that's true.
Wow.
And that really just opened my eyes at how important it is for parents to be consistent with what they say. As Josh moved through those rehabs, and it's hard to see your son living on the street. It's hard to not know where your son is, to call him on the phone and him not being willing to tell you where he is because he's in some halfway house somewhere or under a bridge somewhere. And finally one Easter, he called me about 2 weeks before Easter, and he said, Dad, can I come home? And I said, well, son, are you sober? And he was honest. He said, no, but he said, can I come home for Easter? And I said, well, yeah. I said, you can come home, but you're going to have to go. Cindy was over guest services at a mega church here in town. I said, you're going to have to work all of the Easter services, and they were doing 5 or 6, with your mom and serve in the parking lot. If you're willing to do that, you can come home. So he came home. So Friday night he went with her, and everybody wanted to adopt him. It was like, where has this boy been? Why hasn't he been around? Came home, everything was great. Saturday night, same thing. Went served in the Saturday afternoon services. Everybody loved him. Came home, went in his room, and got high. We called 911. By the time they got there, the stuff he was using was out of his system. He passed sobriety tests. And when they left, he looked at me and he said, Dad, I know I can't stay here tonight, but can I sleep in the car? And I said, yeah, you can sleep in the car, but in the morning you've got to get up and go with your mom and serve in the parking lot. So he said, okay. So we gave him blankets. It was cold. It was an April morning. He slept in the car. He got up. Next morning, went to church, served, came home, and he said, Dad, can I stay in the car one more night? I don't have anywhere to go. I said, yeah, but I said, in the morning, I'll take you wherever you want me to take you. So he slept in the car that night and got up the next morning. And I said, Josh, where do you want me to take you? And he said, Dad, I don't have anywhere to go. He said, all my friends have disowned me. And he said, all the drug dealers I owe money, they're looking for me. And I said, well, son, I know a halfway house, a homeless shelter in downtown Dallas, and I'll take you there. They'll give you a bed. And he said, okay. So it was the longest 45 minutes of my life. I drove him downtown. My shirt just was a little soaking wet with tears when I let him out. And I just looked at him and I said, Josh, I love you, and I always will love you, but I can't have you in my house until you decide you're going to get healthy. He stayed there for a week, and he texted me on the next Sunday morning, and he had left the halfway house. And he said, Dad, I'm so sorry for everything that I've done and all the heartache I've caused you and Mom and all the money I've caused you. And he said, I'm taking all my meds, and I'm going to take my life. I'm sorry. And he went dark on me. He wouldn't answer my texts. I didn't know where he was. I spent the next couple of days trying to find his body in the morgues in town because I thought he was dead. And on Tuesday night, he called me and he said, Dad, I'm really ticked. I said, why, son? He said, I can't even kill myself. And I said, Josh, you know, you have never wavered when I've questioned you about your salvation experience. When you and I prayed together and you invited Christ into your life. And I said, if that's really true, then you probably can't kill yourself because I think God's got something for you to do. He came out of he was in the psych ward at the county hospital. When he got off the phone, there was a little orderly that looked at him, had heard the conversation, and said, Josh, he said, you're just like the prodigal. You need to come to yourself. And of all the preachers we had prayed for Josh and all the counselors, some of the best counselors in the country, I think those words rang more true to his heart than anything anybody had said. You need to come to yourself. He came out. We got him he went to a detox unit for a while. Came out. We got him into a sober house. He promptly got drunk and got kicked out of the sober house. Talked his way back in, and that was 13 years ago, and he's been sober for 13 years. A man heard him. He was going to AA meetings. A man heard him tell his story, said, I want to hire you to come work in my rehab center, but you've only been sober 9 months. I can't hire you until you've been sober a year. And at a year, the man got in contact with him. He began to work in a rehab center. After 13 years, he's been married 4 years now? 5 years. And he and his wife own a recovery center in Fredericksburg for women called Fullbrook Recovery Center. And God is just doing an incredible work in his life every day.
It was interesting. The first time, it was La Hacienda. What was the one? Origins is the one we went to work at down at South Padre Island. And we went to visit him. And he was working there as a pretty low-level resident.
The night
advocate,
orderly.
Yeah, type person. And as he introduced us around, almost without fail, everybody would say, thank you so much for kicking him out. And evidently in his story, he will tell you the thing that got his attention is that his parents made a rule that you cannot have drug and alcohol in our house, and we enforced it. Because everyone was saying, thank you so much because he's such a great guy for kicking him out. I don't know if that's always the right thing to do, but I know that when you set some boundaries for your house, and if you excuse your kids for their behavior, if you enable them in any way, we do have a friend that they have enabled their child for so many years that he's in his 50s now and still dependent on his parents. And we did not want to do that, and we had some long conversations about it. And there were some long conversations at each time. Do we break a rule? Do we break a rule? We said, I don't think, for his benefit, I think. Were we scared? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Could it had a different outcome? Oh, yeah. Oh, it could have. In our case, it worked out, but I think that's just by the grace of God. I don't think if you
And we
kick your child out,
knew-
you're going to guarantee that they're going to,
If
you
we
know,
knew
get
that
straight.
he kept on that road, if he
We
kept
knew.
it, we knew he was going to end up dead. I mean, we knew that was going to happen. So that was almost, from that standpoint, we knew the only way we could get his attention was to let him suffer the consequences of his actions.
But another thing, that will not work unless husband or wife are together.
Yeah.
You know, and it's really hard when there's a divorce involved if they're not married and dad wants one approach and mom wants another approach. Even if they're not married, they really need to be together on it. It's so important for the physical health of your child, the emotional, all of it. I mean, it's so important that mom and dad are together. And you don't have to do it like we did. I mean, there's other ways around it. I'm not saying that our boundaries and our rules were just the exact right ones, but that you have boundaries in that relationship and you stick to it, whatever they are.
And you have to trust God to work in even the darkest of the situations. He had taken all of his drugs, his medication, and some inhalant and laid down behind a convenience store in Arlington to die. And who I will always believe was an angel found him and called 911 and then took a picture of him laying on the ground with a can of inhalant on his chest.
One shoe on, one shoe off.
Found him on Facebook and sent him that picture and said, I don't know you, but I know this is how you're going to end up if you don't get right with God. And he still has that picture that he carries with him. It's a funny thing. His name is Lamar. So if you Google me, you very well may find one of his intake pictures of being arrested. And he called me one day and he said, hey, Dad, this magazine published that picture and they contacted me, and if I will pay them $39, they'll take it out. And I said, well, Josh, what did you tell them? He told them, he said, I'll pay you $39 to keep the picture in there to remind me of where I've been and where I am now.
Wow. Well, that is quite the journey, right? Addiction. It's so heartbreaking for families. It is such a conundrum because you want to protect them, and yet the best protection is allowing them to have the consequences of their choices. They need someone to save them from themselves, right? And if we keep enabling them, you're right. I've had that in my family as well. Enabled, and then they're in their 50s and 60s and still can't do life, right? So you're really, it's easy to say than to do.
It's hard to do.
It is very hard to do, to allow your child to go to a homeless shelter and you drive off not knowing the results.
Yeah, and you know, part of that too is what Cindy said a minute ago was the fact that you're together on it. Usually dad tends to be the hard nose and mom wants to be the soft one. Well, Cindy stood with us. I mean, we were together on every decision we made, even the hard ones to kick him out when it was cold outside or whatever. But the other thing that I would tell you is that we've had a small group of friends that we've been with for over 20 years. And we were very transparent with them from day one of what was going on with Josh. And every week we met, we would pray for him, and they stood with us throughout every aspect of it. And it was funny, at my mom's funeral, our small group came to the funeral, and Josh came to the funeral, and he was sober by now, and it was the first time they had ever met him. And it was like a family reunion at my mom's funeral, because that small group, I would tell any parents, get in a group where you can be transparent, where you can share your heart, where you don't have to put up a facade or front, but you can be real and have friends who pray with you and stand with you through whatever the consequences are.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. I was going to ask, what would you tell a parent that just senses that their child is struggling with addiction? Should
I
they
would-
go to, yes,
I
what
would
you
say if the rule in your house is no alcohol or no, and we don't drink, so that was an easy one for us. If you are a drinker, which obviously is everybody's right and no judgment there whatsoever, but if you are, then you have to, it just gets messy then.
Right.
You know what I mean? What do you have in your house? Do you have to lock it up? Whatever you do. But we were not drinkers, and so having that rule was easy to enforce because we were together on it. But I think one of the things that I want to remind everybody is there is no perfect parent.
Right.
There isn't. You're going to make mistakes.
Right.
And it's okay to tell your child, well, I probably didn't handle that right. I'm really sorry. Let me talk to Dad and let's reevaluate everything and go. You can make adjustments.
Yes.
In maybe if you've made the boundaries too tight on them or whatever. But I do think that it's very reasonable to have a breathalyzer. They make little ones, a breathalyzer, or to require drug tests if you suspect that your child is, because that's one of the rules in your house.
Yeah,
we did
and-
have a breathalyzer, and we did take him.
We took him to be
We
drug
took him
tested
to
if
be
we
drug
ever
tested.
suspicion it. For one thing, from a child's perspective, if parents are testing him, that's ammunition for him when his peer pressure says, hey, come have a drink with us. I can't, my mom and dad test me. I think another thing that just parents beat themselves up a lot of times because they have a child who is addicted. No parent makes the right decision all the time.
All the time. We just
But
don't.
We have 3 kids in our household, and we had basically the same rules for all 3 of them. Now, the consequences were different and how we enforced them were different, but basically we had the same rules as far as a child living in our house. We had 2 children who made the right decision. We had 1 who made the wrong decisions. But they both were under the same discipline, the same everything. Mm-hmm. And so parents need to remember their kids have a free will.
Yes.
That's the way God created them. A parent can do everything right, and the kid can still make bad decisions. And so parents can't beat themselves up over decisions that their kids make. Are there things that we could all do better? Absolutely.
And
But-
we should continue to try to do better.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, if we haven't enforced boundaries, rules that you've made, if you haven't enforced boundaries, you can begin, and they will adjust. They're smart like that. But they also know that if they test those boundaries, and you know, history tells you mom, dad give in. Well, if you choose not to, and I would say this is to try to do it as unemotionally as you can, almost like an employee-employer. You know, these are the rules. If you want the paycheck, you know, this is what it is. You keep the emotion out of it, and it really helps, especially for moms, because it's really easy to get emotional. But if you take the emotion out of it, it makes it a lot more civil, to say the least.
And one of the best ways to take the emotion out of it is those decisions need to be made before there's a time of testing. You know, we've made this decision, that's it, here are the consequences, you know that. And to make sure that your kid knows what those rules are.
That's good.
And knows what the consequences are. Don't blindside them. That's not fair to them either. But from the very beginning, they know you're going to be consistent. Here's the rules we live by, and they'll do fine if they live that way.
Yeah, I think you pointed out a good point, is expectations. It's having those expectations, having that conversation, and even having the conversation with, this is really hard for mom and dad. We don't want you to have the consequences of your actions. We want to protect you. But we know, as a healthy human being, to move forward, you're going to have to deal with whatever's driving you to self-medicate, to do the drugs, to do whatever it is that you're choosing to do. You'll need to figure out what needs to be healed. Where's the trauma? What's created that need in you to feel like drugs are the answer? And so I think it is setting those expectations. And as you said, a very good point is the trust. It's interesting, being hard sometimes does teach them they can trust you and that they know it's motivated through love, right? And so I do speak for, I want to speak to those that maybe a church is not where you would feel natural turning to. I can tell you, for me, that is where I found my help. In a church, churches are all different, right? Because churches are full of people. So they're all going to be different. But I did find one that was willing to help me through my anxiety, through my panic attacks. You feel a lot of shame. You feel shame when you're going through panic attacks, because I felt like I was a strong person, and yet why am I having this anxiety and fear? And I think even as parents of someone who's struggling with addiction, you can feel like a little bit of shame on, I don't really, because you feel like people are maybe judging you on your parenting, right? But I think it's important, find either a community group, a church that can help you. You need some tight friends that you can be honest and real and support you in. And I think that's very important. And I just would say to Cindy and to Lamar, thank you so much for sharing this journey. And it's amazing the outcome that Josh has been able to stay sober 13 years. And I have several friends actually that have battled drug addiction and alcoholism, and they are still sober. It can be done.
It can be.
Is it easy? No. Is it easy? No, because some of that's just your personality. I think I easily would have turned into an addict. My mother, like I said, was an alcoholic. She was in at least 4 or 5 hospitals for her depression. I had a sister that died of a drug overdose. I mean, I know that was my genetic predisposition and also my temperament to, I live on the edge, I did. But I'm so grateful for the people in my life that have helped me get through it. And the counseling definitely helped in finding counselors that were good at helping me figure out what's driving the insecurity, what's driving the fear that was leading me to want to, to medicate in those cases. Well, thank you again for being here.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for sharing. And I would just say thank you for being here. I hope parents, if you have someone struggling, a child struggling with addiction, a sister, sibling, and kids, if you're watching this, you're teenagers, and you have a parent that's struggling with addiction, I want you to reach out to your school teacher. I want you to reach out to the counselors at school. It's very important that you know that they want to help you as well. But we have to be honest, and sometimes that's hard to do. So reach out and ask for help. It's very important. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope this has blessed you.